Hello, fellow griever. This is the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I am Melissa, your host. This week, you have found yourself with me for one of my shorter, solo, down the rabbit hole episodes. Here, I take you with me on a journey of sorts, through thoughts in my own griefy mind. Some days, I may tackle topics as if I am in Alice's shoes, slaying the Jabberwocky. And on others, I may end up in my own pool of tears. Or I may just go a bit sideways and paint the proverbial roses red. But I always promise an adventure. So let's dive down the rabbit hole and see just what sorts of madness we might discover together. I am glad you have joined me, because while I do know how lonely this grief is, I also believe we needn't be alone. Welcome. Hello and welcome, fellow grievers. You have reached Season 5, Episode 20 of the Leftover Pieces Suicide Loss Conversations podcast, and I'm Melissa, your host. Today is a Part 2 episode of a 3-part series I'm doing. Today's episode is entitled The Rest of My Story, the Analysis of the Essay. So I am going to be giving my thoughts, my opinion, my own personal analysis, and that's all it is, my own opinion of the article that I read in episode 1, or I should say part 1. It was episode 19 of season 5. And that article is linked in all 3 show notes for all 3 parts of this series. And it is called Talking Suicide Blues. Could one young man's words have pushed 4 others to kill themselves? It was put out in January of 2022 and written by a woman named Jeanette Cooperman for an online essay publication for a university in St. Louis. And so it is fairly important to listen to these in order, otherwise they just really won't make sense. So if for any reason you have stumbled upon this and have not listened to part 1, you should consider going back to listen to that one first. So this actually makes sense to you. So I'm going to start my analysis by reading, I'll read bits and pieces of the article again, and then I'll respond to it. And the first thing I want to respond to is the first couple of sentences. 5 deaths, 1 young man at the center. At least that is where he seems to be. And is it by coincidence or intention, she asks. Between August 2016 and April of 2017, 4 young men in Kirksville, Missouri die by suicide. All by the same method. It is their mutual friend Brandon who finds the first 2 bodies. Told of the third friends, he startles police by asking to see the body. When officers inform him of the 4th, they find him unusually curious about who found the body and where. They divulge no details, but they do inform Grossheim that his name and email were written on a scrap of paper found so close to the body it could have dropped from the young man's hands. So, at least for me, this part all just rings, very accurate. It's like I said in the first part where I read the article, the reason I chose to read this essay to tell my story, to tell the rest of my story, is because to date, this is the article that I have found that has the most research done and does have the most facts in it. Most of them are true. I'll respond a little bit to the fact that, of course, when you read any article like this, there's always going to be a little bit of agency or leeway taken by the author in some parts because, 2 reasons. One, because perception becomes reality in our world, and the author's reality or her perception of something may be different based on how she took it in or what she remembers. And 2, because, to make it more interesting, right? Or to make it more dramatic, to make the writing, the words jump off the page more effectively. So we always have to consider that when we're reading articles and try to dilute them down without the drama in them. And I will apologize here if any of you are hearing a slight whir or noise in the background. I have turned my fan on. It is very hot here in Puerto Rico today, and there feels like there's no air movement. And I try to record without the fan. I will do my level best to remove the noise from the background. It doesn't always work, but thanks ahead for understanding. So going back to what I was talking about today, I'm going to try to break down fact from fiction, likely from far-fetched. And given that I've already said that I feel like this is one of the most accurate articles out there, it's not like there's going to be a whole lot to debunk or argue with necessarily, but there is some relevant points I want to make in my analysis. And then in part 3, I will go on to talk about why I'm talking about this. What do we do now and why is this relevant to my audience? So I hope if you've come this far and you make it through this episode, still interested, I hope you will listen to episode 3. And I would love emails or comments, anything you want to let me know about. I always ask that you just be kind. I think in the world today, lots of people, myself included, would love to have feedback and opinions, and it's okay to have varying opinions and disagree. But I also say we should always lead with kindness, even when we are not in complete agreement. So on a forum like this, where we're already dealing with suicide loss, I just ask that we all lead with kindness when we comment or reach out to each other. So we're dealing with a case that started with the death of my son, Alex. He was 21 years old. He was at college in Kirksville, Missouri at Truman State University at the time of his death. And from the time of his death on August 7th of 2016 until April, just 8 months later of 2017, there were 4 boys that died. And by July, so just 11 months after Alex died, there were actually 5 deaths. Why is that relevant? Well, because they all died in the same manner. They were all in the same circle. 3 of them died in the fraternity house. They all, including the 5th death that was not suicide, all of them had one person in common. And by in common, I mean one person that the police came to closely associate with each and every one of these deaths. The young man in common's name is Brandon Grossheim, and he, unbeknownst to us at the time, had quickly become a pivot point for the Kirksville Police Department by the time they had found the 3rd and 4th boy in this series of deaths that many articles and places have called a contagion, and I will address that more in episode 3. So ironically, Grossheim was a psychology major at the time of his withdrawal from the university at 2016. It was December of 2016, I think, when he withdrew. My son died in August of 2016, as did one of the other boys, just 20 days after my son. So by the time Brandon withdrew, there were 2 of the frat boys already, 2 of them were already deceased, and Brandon was removing himself not only from the fraternity, from the university. So Jeanette Cooperman talks about this part with Brandon, I think, because she alludes to the fact that for years she had been haunted in her own mind, in her own heart, by a couple of friends of hers in the past that have died by suicide. And she has felt haunted by whether she could have said or done something to stop them. And she goes on later in the article to kind of tie this all back to this whole point of, was Brandon, when the question's posed of was he acting from malice and intent, or was he acting from a place of just ill-placed or, immaturity of a young person who is on some level trying to help but isn't properly equipped to do so. And so that's why I bring that part up, because I do think that it's interesting. And then this takes us to the whole center of the article, which is, could Grossheim's words and or actions have actually pushed or coerced these young men into ending their own lives? She asks the question of how much responsibility do we bear, morally, if not legally, in the presence of someone who is emotionally vulnerable? And that's a good question. It's actually going to be the basis for what I talk about in part 3. But for this one, I'll continue on with my analysis of the essay in general. And she did talk about how the young men struggled, how all of them struggled, and she means mental health-wise or emotionally. And I won't be able to speak as closely to whatever she has to say about the other young men, but I will speak briefly to the very first paragraph where she starts to talk about my son. And it's not a very long paragraph. She writes this: a sociable, fun-loving 21-year-old with a high school record of straight A's and varsity baseball, Alex Mullins came undone in his sophomore year at Truman State. Depression and poor performance landed him on academic probation. Nightmares eroded his resilience. By June, he had stopped going to counseling. Then he stopped taking a prescribed antidepressant. That's the whole paragraph there that starts the picture, if you will, that's being painted in the head of people for about my son. And so, I try really hard not to be that person that takes things overly personal, that I try to be as subjective as possible. I try to understand that she didn't know him. She's only looking at what she knows and what she's researched and seen written. And this goes back to what I had said earlier about how articles are written with perception and often, an embellishment or, making the words sound better. So I'm going to just break down the last 2 sentences, or maybe the last 3 there, and just respond for a brief moment to make my point. So it says, depression and poor performance landed him on academic probation. Nightmares eroded his resilience. Depression and poor performance. Those, in a nutshell by themselves, are probably true. Was Alex probably depressed? Yes, the last 5 or 6 months of his life, for sure. He had been going through a lot. I believe it was an acute depression, not a chronic depression. He had never been seen by mental health professionals before. And that we'll get to that next sentence in a minute about he had stopped going to counseling. But so he had not been diagnosed. So sometimes you have to kind of cringe a little bit, especially in this world of suicide and mental health, when quote unquote diagnoses or diagnosis appearing words get put out there. He was on a precursor to academic probation. His grades had started to drop. He had graduated high school with an international baccalaureate diploma, which is a very high diploma for high school. And so he was used to rigorous academics, and Truman State was known to be an academically rigorous college. So they had a program in place for if somebody was, sliding downhill towards academic probation, they would put them on that program to try to prevent academic probation from happening. So he was definitely not expelled or on probation. He was actively in college and going to classes, and he was actually doing well at that program. So I don't think he would have been put on academic probation. And it was honestly just, I believe, a snowball effect of 2 years in college, managing a fraternity, a part-time job, academics, girlfriend and him broke up, just life as a 21-year-old person. And I also believe that was at the source of the depression. Some of the things I mentioned, plus later we found out that he was really struggling. Well, I shouldn't say later. I knew somewhat that summer as well, but that he was really struggling with some conflict inside the fraternity with some of his classmen in his fraternity. So there was a lot going on. And then it says by June he had stopped going to counseling. Then he stopped taking his prescribed antidepressants. So I'll just make this point really quick and then I'll move on with the rest of my analysis. So some of this information obviously came from us. How would they have known by June he stopped going to counseling? Well, they may have gotten his counseling records. What she leaves out here is that he had only gone to a couple of brief appointments at the school counseling center. I knew he was going. We had talked about whether he felt like he needed more. He actually said at the time that he didn't think he did, but that he wasn't really finding it very helpful. He had only gone twice. They were always on long wait lists. He couldn't get in. He wasn't seeing an actual doctor. He was seeing like an intern or something, I think. And it said he had stopped taking his prescribed antidepressant. And he had been prescribed something from what we saw in his records, and he told me he was prescribed something, but at 21, young men don't get super involved when telling their mom all the details, and they're not usually very detail-oriented. So while I knew he had been given Zoloft, I also knew he only took it 2 weeks or less because he told me, and he told me he quit because he didn't really like how it made him feel. And so he wasn't taking it long enough to have it adequately in his system or anything like that. So while we do take issue with the fact that the counseling center behaved very irresponsibly after getting his records, we did not know that beforehand because they prescribed this out of the gate. They prescribed it and put a very inaccurate diagnoses in his folder to back up the prescribing of the antidepressant, even though there's no way they could have come to the conclusion in one short visit that he had a major mental health diagnosis, which he did not. We have found out later that he's not alone. This happened a lot at that counseling center. And probably, to be honest, plenty of other colleges and high schools, or maybe not high schools, but college campuses, this kind of thing probably happens where I'm going to say that I'm assuming that the people prescribing or wanting to prescribe these medications are just wanting to help the kids. And because they don't have enough appointments and the schedule's backed up, they're probably thinking they were doing a good thing, but it wasn't really necessary. So I'm just pointing out that the picture that's been painted is of a severely depressed, poor performing student on academic probation. I don't know about the nightmares eroded his resilience. I'm not really sure where that phrase comes from. And then he quit going to counseling and he stopped taking his medication, which now that I've given you the backstory of that, it sounds different than when you read it the first time, which it sounds like he had been going to a counselor for a very long time and the implication is he stopped taking a prescribed medication. Makes it sound like he just dropped his medication that maybe then caused some issues by doing that. And instead, he hadn't been taking it long enough to create any effect, nor had he been going to counseling in an ongoing fashion. So yeah, it just paints a different picture than maybe what was really more accurate. And I just want everybody to kind of take that in as we read this article or any articles, knowing that these elements exist, that we need to kind of strip things down and assume that often things are being made to sound more dramatic or different than they actually are. So I do believe all of these young men were struggling on some level, my son included. I believe that was what made them the target for Brandon Grossheim, who self-proclaimed, called himself in interviews he did with the police and places like that. So when I say self-proclaimed, places that he was recorded, and friends came forward and said the same thing, that he saw himself as a superhero. He even called himself the peacemaker. I talk about that in the first one. He thinks he can help cure the pain of struggling friends. He says he gravitates towards people that are struggling. And Jeanette Cooperman in this article talks about that later too. She talks about how, was that just ultimately him trying to help, or was that something more sinister? Well, that's the big question, right? I have no problem going on record as saying 8 years in, with everything I know, I don't believe it was well-intentioned, not for 1 second, but that's my opinion. So then she goes on to talk about that Grossheim finds Alex by looking through the window. She talks about the house manager piece, which is very jarring to say the least, the contradiction of the fact that Alex was the outgoing house manager, Brandon was the incoming house manager, so he would have had keys to all the rooms, Brandon would have, even though he claims he had no way to get into the room, claims that they tried the window, even though once the police showed up and he jumped right through. So that's where, for us, I want to add to this article and say that this case was handled so poorly. We knew nothing of that at the time. We were in a fog. We were in shock. My son was deceased, and I had no basis for asking any of the questions or knowing anything that wasn't the way it should be. But we received the phone call almost about 12:30 noon, after 12 noon, that Alex was deceased. We were up, and they had just called 911 at that time. Truman was a little over 2 hours away, about 2.5 hours. So by the time we got there, was less than 3 hours after the 911 call. Yet at the time that we got there, Alex was already removed from the scene. There was no police tape of any sort. His room was not locked. As a matter of fact, Alex's possessions had been packed up, not entirely. At the time we thought entirely, but we found out later not entirely. But they had packed up many of his possessions and clothing and things and put them by the front door. So I won't go into this part of, the case, because there's so many parts that are not public or not in public documents and things like that. And I don't want to go into all of that. But I will tell you that it was a completely botched situation from the beginning. I'm going to guess most of my audience knows that suicide should be investigated fully to determine that it definitively is suicide, because there are murders that are staged as suicide. There are accidents that occur that may appear like suicide initially and things like that. So there is a full investigation that's supposed to occur. In my son's case, they show up, fraternity, treat it like a cut and dry, whatever that means, like suicide, and they just walk away from it. They literally turn the room over from the time that they leave to the fraternity, who proceeds to pack things up. And later, when we knew there was a reason to get police reports, which was not until after the fourth young man had died in April. So we went for 8 full months grieving my son's suicide, grieving the second young man's suicide, and believing at that point that 2 young men, 20 days apart, that we were looking at a contagion situation. It changed later. After the fourth young man died in April, and by the summer, by the time we were nearing the 1-year anniversary, we knew differently. But it took all of those things happening, and for deaths and forensic investigators and people telling us that we needed to go get records and take a look at things before we ever even knew anything was suspicious. And what I have to say, the only reason I say that is because there are other articles out there. Many of them regurgitated. Many of them were put together very quickly. So all of the facts don't match all of the people, and it's garbled at best. Some of it is. And for us, it was that way when we started collecting information around 9 months after Alex was gone, and we realized that there might be something strange going on. We even realized that the police reports from that day didn't match. They literally had done such a bad job that what police reports they did write didn't even match. And by didn't even match, I mean 3 or 4 different police officers, I think it was 3, wrote reports that arrived at the scene. And they didn't even have the names of the same boys doing the same things, like who called, who jumped through the room, who talked to them. Several of them had different people even named, and they eventually redacted them because they realized that they were wrong when we pointed it out, but everything was done. And we honestly didn't even know that the fraternity or university was even aware that anything odd was going on with Brandon. We weren't notified. We weren't told they were curious or looking into it. We didn't know that they had reopened my son's case, which, as I told you, they basically treated as an open and shut case. But we didn't even know that until we went up there in late April to visit and gather police reports and things on the advice of a forensic, an ex-forensic detective that we spoke to and an ex-forensic pathologist that we spoke to. At that point, we went up to collect information so that people could tell us whether they felt like there was anything to be concerned about. And at that point, the police told us they had reopened Alex's case, but it took a long time before, in retrospect, we thought, why weren't we notified that they were reopening the case? Why weren't we notified that they were watching this young man, that this young man had been asked by the fraternity to leave, that there were many people suspicious of his behaviors, not just including how he acted, but including that he was doing things like wearing clothing, taking personal items, lots of other things that some of which are not public, but things that are very suspicious and curious, to say the least. Many of which had to do with how he reacted or where he presented himself at the time of death. So for the 5 deaths that we're talking about that occurred within the year, Alex being the first, he found Alex and was the one that yelled to call 911. He's the one that jumped through the window and handled Alex's body. In the second case, and we think he may be the last person to have had contact with Alex. In the case of the second young man, 20 days later, he was the last person to see and speak to him. He was also the person to find him. And the third young man was actually not in the fraternity, but he was a friend of all the fraternity members. So I've always called him a quote unquote honorary member because he hung out with them so much. And his family owned a restaurant that many of them worked at, and an apartment building that some of them came to live in, and things like that. So this boy was very interwoven with the fraternity boys. And Brandon was, at the time of that young man's death, he was no longer in the fraternity, he was no longer in the university, and he was living across the hall in that apartment building from the third young man that died. And so he wasn't the young man, he wasn't who found him, but he was across the hall. And besides the young man's girlfriend, he was the first person on the scene in the hallway with the police, saying that he had been, one of the last ones besides the girlfriend to see the young man. And he was very inquisitive about the young man's condition and how he was presented. He wanted to see him, and of course the police did not let him. The third young man, he wanted to, he was not on the scene. However, the fourth young man died in the house also. And this young man, Brandon Grossheim, his name and email were written in, as far as we've been able to determine, Brandon's handwriting in so close a proximity to the young man's body that it either fell out of his hand or coat pocket or something. So, and then when he was visited by the police, who took a counselor with them to tell them of this young man's passing, because they had found his name right by this young man, and they recognized his name as being involved closely with the other 3 deaths, they went and saw him, and he had a very odd response, to say the least. And then the young woman, even though she was not a suicide, she died in the same apartment that the third young man lived in. He was still living across the hall. So now he has lived across the hall from 2 people who have died. He's the last person to see them. He's the first person to find the young woman, and tells the police the story. And there is nothing to indicate that she died of suicide. But this one kind of speaks to his obsession with people not only that are struggling, but even death. And that's talked about in other places too. And so she obviously doesn't go into all of this because she didn't know some of it. And as I've said, I know lots and lots more interesting, disturbing is a much better word, behaviors of Brandon that were collected for the case that are not public record that I'm not necessarily going to talk about here today. But just know there's a lot of really odd behavior that go far beyond coincidence where this young man is involved. And as Jeanette Cooperman's essay is kind of asking a question, and it's an essay, not a journalistic article, so to speak, I understand why she didn't go into every single bit of hearsay or things about Brandon, and I actually appreciate it because a lot of articles that are written go into just that. So I will tell you that the things that she does talk about that are curious and coincidental and all those things, they're just the tip of the iceberg about the things that we have found out about this young man over all the years since the passing of my son and these young men. And, there's plenty of it's public knowledge. There's a young woman who was a neighbor of his who gives several statements throughout over time that the press report on about his behavior. And, she even said that a lot of the fraternity brothers think he's guilty. And then she added, because they know the truth. And actually, I may be misquoting. I actually think that was the statement that was said by the young woman who gave an interview for the local news in Kirksville. She went to the news station in November of 2019. So just a few months after we filed the case. And one of her reasons for going was she said the families need to find out the answers and justice needs to be served. And she even told them that if she had continued to stay in Brandon's path, that she could have been his sixth. And that was her statement. And again, the friend that lived with him in the building that knew him during all of this, had made several statements about his demeanor and behavior, including his obsession with death and things like that. So we get the picture. He's a disturbed young man at best. And, some articles pose the question, was he disturbed before, or is he disturbed because he happens to be at the center of all of these suicides? And of course, I put accidentally in quotes or coincidentally because I don't believe that kind of coincidence can exist. I don't, for 1 second, believe it, knowing everything I know. But some of the articles, depending on when they were written and what angle they come from, will say things like that. They will somewhat imply that he was simply a grieving friend who ended up being in the wrong place at the wrong time over and over again. Which, it's funny because I've read some things, and I don't mean funny in the traditional sense, but it's odd, to say the least, that it's easier for some people to think, and I don't think there's a lot of this out there at this point, but there are some people that are still in the camp of feeling bad for this young man, like he's somehow a victim. And I don't know how it makes more sense that somebody would continue to just turn up where people are dead, be the last person to be hanging out with them, and then have all these other things about them as well, and have somebody say, yeah, poor guy. It doesn't make sense to me, even if my son wasn't at the center of this, but that's just my take on it. So yes, to me, at the heart of things, is he death obsessed? Yes, he has a history. He talked about his death obsession to more than one person, including police and interviews like that. He called himself the peacemaker. He talked about a history where he found his grandma. I think I already told you, he wanted to know time of death and became obsessed with the time of death and wanting to know the manner of death with one of the young men. He wore clothes and items of the people he dated, girlfriends after boys had gone. He asked to see bodies. He has, the couple of young women I just talked about, plus there's another young woman he was dating, and she gave an interview and talked about how she immediately broke it off with him when he had his hand on her stomach, and she was very uncomfortable with how he was doing it and what had his ear, and he told her he was just listening to and watching her breathe, and the whole thing made her feel so weird that she actually cut off contact with him. So there's so many accounts, so many more than are even public, about the behavior of a disturbed young man. And yet there are all these reports of him being kind and sweet and charismatic and sometimes funny. And some people report that he was never more than a nice friend to them. Now, I'm going to say maybe those people never had depression. But I'm going to just go out on a limb and tell you that many people thought Ted Bundy was amazing. Many people thought Richard Ramirez or Jeff Dahmer or even Charles Manson were charming, easy to be drawn in by, persuasive. I mean, I'm just putting that out there as a fact. So then she does also talk about how there's no hard evidence. That's why there was no criminal convictions or trials. That's why there's a civil suit. Because after we hired an attorney to do the rest of the investigation, and then she came back and said that there was more than enough, but that we had to go the civil route, because that's the only way our system, when there is not a way to bring criminal charges, the only thing you can do to try to flesh out more and to try to get some answers, to try to have some accountability, is to file a civil suit. It's the way our system works. It was the only option that we had to try to do some of those things, like get more answers and hope that we could work towards an accountability piece at some point. However, I'm just going to say again, in my humble opinion, I don't think I'm the only one to hold the opinion, but this is my opinion on my podcast. They did such a poor job of investigating. And between the police department and the university and the fraternity, they did such a good job at trying to do everything they could to squash this, push this aside, throw it in a box in the attic in the corner, and wish it away. There was no concern for the families. There was no concern for the student body, other than not wanting this to leak out too much and cause there to be problems with enrollment and, all the things you can imagine. There was never even a memorial for any of these young boys. As a matter of fact, the fraternity continued to operate as if nothing happened, clear until all 4 boys were gone. So the 4th young man, who died in April of 2017, was actually rushing when the 2nd young man died. So my son died on August 7th. The 2nd young man died on August 27th. In that 20 days, rush was occurring. So Alex had died in his room. Apparently somebody else moved into it. We later found out almost right away. And they go on as normal with all of their stuff, including rush. Rush is happening, and then the 2nd young man dies. And they do a good job at kind of not making a big deal about it. So a lot of the new pledges don't even realize that Alex had died 20 days earlier, which, can you even believe that, right? To even say that out loud. I have friends that were in the Greek life in college when I was in college in Lawrence, Kansas, at the University of Kansas. And we had really big Greek houses there. And several of my friends said they can't imagine their house not being shut down, at least temporarily, and probably parties completely shut down with just 1 suicide on the premise, let alone 2 within 20 days, and having rush and all their activities go on as normal. No memorials are planned, no nothing. One of the moms eventually had a photo mailed to her of the fraternity class for that year because she asked for it. I never had anything sent to me. And again, there was nothing done to even commemorate the life, let alone They had several charity events they did that year. None of them had to do with suicide or mental health. They had to do with like homeless can drives and things like that, which are good things. But given the scenario there in the fraternity, they probably should have been focusing on things that were more relevant to their situation. So as I wrap this up, I'll tell you that as Jeanette Cooperman wraps her article up, she talks about how in her 20s, when she was young, that she attracted many troubled souls, and that friends teased her about the fact that she attracted so many, troubled souls. One of them even smudged her apartment with sage, she says in this article. And she, then talks about how once she married, how all these people that used to lean on her kind of just quit leaning on her. And was she a magnet of sorts when she was a single woman for this type of person to be a confidant? And she said, even though what she felt was only sympathy, she now thought, rather than flat out empathy, that if she had had a little less serotonin coursing through her own brain, that an abyss for her could have even opened up in that time. And so she's still exploring the question of, can somebody else's words make that big of a difference? She refers back to this young woman who lived in the building and talked about how soothing his voice was and how he made it easy for people to open up. Well, I gave you my opinion about that just a few minutes ago, right? There's a lot of people in history that fit that bill, and it doesn't mean they are all good people. It doesn't mean there may not be malice or ill intent behind that, or sick mind, right? Which then can cause that malice and ill intent. So towards the very end here, she talks about how the forced suicides over time took the nickname that Brandon had given himself of the Peacemaker, and they twisted that somewhat to, become a moniker, an evil moniker, if you were. And by they, people in social media and stuff that would have comments to say after all of these deaths were publicized, and especially after our case was out. And she says that she looked up the original Peacemaker. And when she does that, she finds DC Comics superhero who's so committed to peace that he's willing to use force to bring it about. Now, his zeal, the DC Comics Peacemaker, is a result of mental illness brought on by the shame of having, a death camp father. And, it's all in the DC comic universe as far as that character. But it says, that he was heavily criticized and things like that. Brandon has a history of mental health issues as well, and potentially issues with childhood abuse and some things. So that narrative is kind of haunting, to say the least. And in DC's extended universe, the Peacemaker character actually returns as a member of the Suicide Squad. So then in the very next ending part, as she wraps up her article, she says, and I agree with her, that pop culture is not evidence, right? So while that part's creepy, to say the least, it's not evidence of anything. Proximity is not complicity. She's right. It's not. Still, the lawsuit makes much of the fact that Grossheim discovered 2 of the deaths had access to the living spaces of all 5, was the last to speak to Hughes and Hote, and was the second last to speak to Vogt. In retrospect, it all sounds shivery and significant. It does. How do you erase that? It is shivery and significant. She also talks about, Facebook posts of his where he's talking about Deadpool, and he has a coffee labeled Death Wish, and he has videos, which, by the way, are super creepy. They're not public anymore, but videos of him reading Grimm's fairy tales with all of its horrors and things that he says there. And then she says, except you could find that many dark references to death in most 19-year-olds' lives. When police asked why he signed a poster to a friend, Die Master, he grinned and explained that he was nimble at a dice-tossing game called Beer Die. So I don't know anything about that game and whether it's a thing to call yourself a Die Master or not. But there's a litany of things with this young man that are that go back to the thing I talked about earlier, which is what appears to be a death obsession. And because I probably won't be mentioning it in part 3, I do want to go back just a little bit in the article before I finish up here in the next few minutes and state that he was given it's called a non-stress test, I think, or a voice stress test. Sorry, non-stress, I think, is for our heart. But a voice stress test, which is the test that's right below a lie detector. There's 2 levels of deception tests that are done by law enforcement officials, and we always know of the polygraph, which is the lie detector. There's also another lie detector test that's a voice stress analysis, and he was given that by the police at one point after all 4 young men were gone, and his results did detect deception. He gave an explanation, I'm sure. That's what the records say, was that he gave an explanation and said he didn't understand all the questions. But no one knows why, including me and our family, as to why they never administered an official lie detector test when the first one showed deception. And the bigger thing is that when you have cases like this that tend to be connected, a lot of times state agencies are brought in to do bigger investigations and try to get to the bottom of it. And the state agencies had been contacted, and they were more than willing to get involved. They were interested. They did think they could help. I got that information from, I was the one that went and saw the state agencies. However, I found out, and I have since had it confirmed multiple times, that it's accurate, that the local agency has to ask the state agency to get involved. And the local agency would not ask the state agency to get involved. So at every turn, their incompetence, that's my opinion. You can't really say that's a fact, but my opinion, the incompetence just was nothing but a snowball rolling downhill out of control. And they just stuck to it. They weren't going to make themselves more competent at any point. They just stuck to, I think they were kind of outgunned. This was bigger than what they knew what to do with, and there had been a lot of mistakes made, and they didn't probably want to draw attention to those mistakes, and the college probably didn't want attention drawn to it. And when you have a small town with a big college in the town, the college is going to help call a lot of the shots, right? Again, my opinion. So I digressed for a minute and went back to that, but I thought it was worth mentioning, and it just jumped into my mind as far as that I hadn't mentioned that he did fail a lie detector test. So then as Jeanette gets to her own kind of summation, if you will, her own type of, I won't even say conclusion because I'm not sure she's definitive on it, but she says here towards the end that her knee-jerk response was to hear the litany of deaths and assume that he somehow was involved, even if unwittingly. But he did not physically cause these deaths, nor did he create the history that led up to them. And then she gives a statement the only statement given by his attorney about, how these allegations with no evidence can practically ruin a young man's life. I'll just leave that there. I have nothing to say to that. That's nice at all. So no hard evidence cited in the lawsuit, right? Because the lack of investigation created no, what you call, quote unquote, hard evidence. Therefore, there's nothing. And, I'm going to talk about all this in part 3. So I won't go deep into that part right now. I will just get to where I'm finishing this part up. In 2010, the statistics say suicide passed homicide to be the second most common cause of death for those ages 15 to 24. So that's 2010, 14 years ago. Between 2007 and 2018, suicide rate increased almost 60%. For similar suicides in that same place, and in one same place, outdoes even these statistics. And then she says, but contagion is real. It is real. Her statement here says direct and indirect exposure to suicidal behavior has often shown to precede an increase in suicidal behavior of persons at risk for suicide, especially in adolescents and young adults, one review says. So the fact that someone else's suicide, especially someone a lot like them, it opens up the possibility of making it available to imitate. And a young person's shift from thinking about suicide to actual suicide is often an impulsive one, blinded by emotion and not planned to end years of playing. And not planned. It's just an impulsive moment. But what she talks about is what is a thing, and that's what contagion is the idea that when we become familiar with an idea and when it somehow touches our life, that then the thought of that is more likely to possibly play out in our life by the sheer familiarity of constantly thinking about it and wondering about it and considering it and. But by the definitions of contagion, most of the time, contagion may happen in a community, it might happen at a school, but you're probably not going to see all of the people. Well, you're not going to see it's contagion. This goes farther than contagion in this case because all the young men were in one house. They all die in the same manner. They all know each other. There's one person that's mutually involved with all of them right before their deaths and right after. That goes outside of the bounds of contagion. So my challenge is that the people that are trying to call this just contagion are doing it to keep themselves safe because they feel safer calling it that than calling it what it is. And besides that type of clustering, she cites another type of clustering. She cites a study back in 1969 where researchers noted that people with attempted suicides have an unusually large number of suicidal friends. The only thing I have to say to that is respectfully, of course, successful people tend to have more successful friends. Deadbeat people tend to have more deadbeat friends. Happy people tend to have happy friends. And sad people or depressed people, obsessive people tend to have friends like them as well. There's lots of sayings out there like misery loves company, right? And so that to me it makes sense, right? I take a little bit of exception at the very end of her article where she talks about the fact that the third young man's former girlfriend who did find him, lived across the hallway from Grossheim, has gone on to completely work on her mental health from the point of feeling suicidal herself and actually making a plan to take her life at some point to now helping other people and being willing to speak out and to bring suicide and the stigma and resilience into the forefront. And so she could have been contagion, but yet she managed to heal. And she alludes to people turning grief around and using sorrow's dark energy to help others. She says that was what Grossheim wanted to do too. The difference is that he does not seem to have been bent on dissuading anyone from suicide or helping them find professional help. He found his own counseling sessions at Truman a waste of time and money and soon stopped going. In his mind, suicide was a matter of free will. He says that in statements at the police officers, and in other places that he was recorded, and other friends that talked about it. So he used that term, that he gave his friends step-by-step instructions and that he wanted them to do their own free will. He uses those are statements that come from him, not statements that have been made up, and they're creepy to say the least, right? So for her to say that he was just somebody trying to use sorrow's dark energy to help others, I'm not saying she thinks he's innocent, but she's bordering a little bit there on thinking that it's not possible. She's saying, here she says, but when someone is young and experienced, swept by intense emotions, refusing professional help and prescribed medication, and preferring the swift release of drugs, booze, and maybe even death, how free are they? The philosopher Galen Strawson scoffs at the notion that any of us has free will. To make a truly free choice, he says simply, someone would have to be in complete control of themselves. These kids were nowhere close. So she says, take your pick. We can blame failed romance, substance abuse, inadequate medical care, or the parents of troubled teenage boys. Or we can do something else that is all at once easier and harder. Blame Grossheim, whose counsel could have pushed them over the edge instead of pulling them back to safety. Her eloquent words say thinking of suicide can feel like a private release valve, a guarantee that if life becomes even less bearable, there will always be an exit. But thinking about doing something makes it feel much more real each time, more possible, and then, by dint of repetition, more probable. If the pain continues, it begins to seem inevitable, especially if others take the same step or you hear others talk about it. You're primed. At the next moment of despair, the needle slips into the groove and the record spins. Is that a free choice, she asks. Maybe we just prefer to see it that way so we can rage against the person who left us. But what if suicide is an absence of choices, a fugue slate of hopelessness, pain, and self-loathing that cancels out the ability to reason or reach for help? In that case, any of us might have done something to prevent it. I find that thought hard to bear. I have the hairs on the back of my neck standing up because she gets there, right? So I'm worried about her at times when I first read this article, a couple of years ago, but she gets there. She gets to the place of saying, but is that really a free choice, right? Were they so influenced and so overtaken by their own despair that it would have been that easy for somebody to potentially persuade them into a place of ending their own life? And how is that free will? She cites Dan Reidenberg, an executive director of an organization called SAVE, which is a suicide organization, and says anytime you take someone really vulnerable and really at risk and they're connected to someone and that person starts to lead them down the wrong path, their vulnerability and risk goes up, particularly if that person presents themselves as a helper or a healer or something different. Yet you have to do something, he says. I have always felt that human being could only be saved by another human being, since James Baldwin. I am aware that we do not save each other very often, but I am also aware that we save each other some of the time. As she wraps up, she says, we do not bear the burden of lives that are not our own, but are we in any way responsible for them? The word is rooted in response. It asks us to offer something in return. And what if what we offer in return for someone else's pain is inadequate? One of the tragedies of young suicide, and maybe the biggest reason for its contagion, is that at that age, a lot of people only trust what comes back from someone who is as messed up as they are, searching just as hard. That is what put Brandon Grossheim at the center of 5 deaths. If these events had unfolded several years later and he had a degree in psychology and sensitive, well-rehearsed clinical skills, he might have persuaded his friends to seek help. Instead, he offered that help himself, leaving them with a terrible freedom that I would argue was not free at all. And next episode, part, the part 3, the final part, I am going to talk about laws and responsibility and wrongful death and all of the things. In other words, what can we do? What do we do now? Why is this important to so many people listening and not just myself? Because while this specific situation is mine, I believe firmly that this situation similar to this exists everywhere. So in part 3, I'm going to answer the why did I talk about this? How is it relevant to my audience? And what do we do? And how do we do it? I'm going to talk about bullying and toxic leadership and clusters and contagion and coercion. We have to talk about all of that. That's where I'm going to go next. I hope that you'll stay with me. Thank you for listening. It means more than I can say. Please subscribe and get notifications. If you haven't already and you've been a long time listener or you're a new listener and you're enjoying the podcast, please take the time at some point to review the podcast on Apple Podcasts. I don't ask that enough. but it makes a difference in helping others find the podcast, which means others can help find resources. So that's become important. I'm going to get a lot better at asking, but if you have not reviewed the podcast, please review it. Please only if you have 5 stars, and I would love to also hear your comments. And if you have anything else to add, you can always reach me through Instagram messages, or you can always reach me at melissa@theleftoverpieces.com. And I also send out a weekly email to just touch base and other things. If you're not on that email list, I would love to have you on it. And I would love you to check out my website to see all the other things I have going on in my community for moms. I have a sibling support group that is offered now by sibling co-facilitators that lead it, and many other things. Until next time, fellow grievers, talk soon. So we'll conclude here for today, but I just wanted to say a few things before you go. If you're new to the podcast and have not listened to the very first episode called Intro Episodes Start Here, all the way back at the beginning of Season 1, I would encourage you to do so that you know what to expect from the Leftover Pieces, because I do have several different styles of episodes that I record, and we do release weekly, almost all of the time. So I hope that you will come back often to join us in this community of suicide loss survivors. If you have not already, also, I would encourage you to check out theleftoverpieces.com, where you can find and have access to all of the things that I currently offer. Some of those things are online Zoom support groups, links to my books, educational opportunities that I'm adding all the time, as well as different downloadables and resources for all suicide loss survivors. And if you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the podcast, or you'd just like to connect with me for any other reason, you can do it through the website as well. So until next time, I just want to remind you that I know how lonely this grief is, but you don't have to be alone. Talk soon.